What's the worst thing that happened after you ignored your body being weird? Randomly lost 20 pounds and had diarrhea constantly. Ignored. 2 months later I out a tapeworm. I suffered a TIA. Transient ischemic attacks. Basically a mini stroke. Male. Aged 42. I was working super long hours. Getting up at 4:30 a.m. and my not sitting down until 10 p.m. most nights and working sun for a short shift. 70 hours week was the norm. Anyways, one night I just nipped the canteen to grab a drink for my way home. Walked down the one step back onto the shop floor and my head. What I can only describe as a giant bubble like you see in the water coolers when you take a drink. It went like that. A air bubble stemming from my neck right up and through the top of my head. I went really dizzy and had to hold onto the wall for only like 5 seconds at the most. I put it down to me maybe misfooting the one step and upsetting my equilibrium. I knew I had not misstepped. But what else could it be? I was a healthy non-smoking, non-drinking 42 years old. All seemed okay if a little groggy, not quite right. Fast forward 1 hour. I am now at home and I slowly lose all my depth perception. I dropped a cup and could not see it right to pick it back up. And most of my motor skills on my left-hand side. My arm and sleeve was dragging into my dinner plate. Luckily my partner was home. Spotted this and took me to hospital ASAP. Scary to think in that 1 hour window I was working a skeleton crew on heavy industrial machines and drove myself home. After that event, so many people told me that my body was trying to tell me something. Ease up and kick back. I now work a 44 hours week and all is good. Kept having stomach upset after eating pasta or bread. Ignored it for about 2 years. Only eating that stuff occasionally. Went out to celebrate my ACT test score with my boyfriend. Had a nice Italian dinner at my favorite restaurant. Complete with bread, pizza, and pasta. This was the first time after not eating any of that for a while. That night I had a horrible stomach ache. And a high fever. Thought nothing of it and went back to work the next day. That is until I saw a bunch of blood and mucus in the toilet after a bout of stomach pains. Turns out all that bread and pasta had caused colitis. An infection of the colon. Wound up in the ER. And on some strong antibiotics. Shortly after I got an endoscopy, colonoscopy and discovered I had celiac. Which is an autoimmune response to eating gluten. The reaction means my body can't process it properly. And thinks the gluten is a foreign invader. As a response, my body attacks my intestines. It causes pain, bloating, diarrhea and constipation. If I eat even a crumb of bread or a lick of soy sauce, I have pains, bloating and severe constipation which lasts for 4 to 6 weeks until my intestines are able to heal. Whoops. I thought it was just intolerance. Not a full-on allergy. I had been living on my own. Teaching on campus in a town where I knew nobody. I would walk about a quarter mile uphill to work each day. I wasn't in the best shape so I was winded by the time I got to the top. When I went home on Christmas and spring break, my mom kept asking how I was so tan. I hadn't really noticed a change and thought she just hadn't seen me in a long time. After spring break I noticed that I had to stop partway up the hill when walking to work. Started losing my appetite, which isn't really that strange for me. And having low blood sugars all the time. I'm T1D. The day I got home after the spring semester ended, I was a visiting professor. I basically had a blackout. I was conscious. But it was like I lost the ability to understand English. And I couldn't really remember it afterward. Ended up being a really low blood sugar. Happened a few more times over the next couple weeks and I lost the ability to sense low blood sugars. I started feeling pretty nauseous a lot of the time. Figured I had a bug. I also started having intense salt cravings. Like pouring salt on microwave popcorn or adding multiple salt packets to a McDonald's French fry before I was able to taste salt. I kept getting more tan. I was finally hospitalized after puking all night. Which typically happens when I'm in diabetic ketoacidosis. Problem was, I showed no other symptoms of it. No ketones. Normal blood sugars. It took them 3 days to bring in an endocrinologist. And he knew what was wrong within minutes. Turns out I was in Addisonian crisis, Addison's disease. They told me my heart would have stopped within a week due to low sodium, high potassium. Back when I was around 14 to 15 I had gotten a headache. Took a Tylenol and thought nothing of it. Next day rinse and repeat. Headache kept getting worse and worse till I was delirious and throwing up. Turns out it was meningitis. Not a fun 2 weeks. I felt a bit dizzy and spaced out for a few hours at work. Which I ignored thinking that I was just a bit hypoglycemic from not eating breakfast and carried on. I then had the worst migraine of my life where the pain was excruciating. The visual aura covered pretty much the whole of my view. I couldn't stop vomiting. My left arm went numb and my left leg was pins and needles below the knee so I could barely stand. My manager was convinced that I was having a stroke so kept pushing me to let her call an ambulance. With me refusing and saying that it was a migraine each time. After about an hour of horrific symptoms the visual aura started to subside and I began to get normal feeling in my limbs again. So she realized that it was indeed a migraine and arranged for me to get picked up by my BF. I had to have a week off work to recover from it because it was so severe compared to approximately 1 day recovery for one of my usual migraines. And I am now on the waiting list to see a neurologist. Had to get a cancerous tumor about the size of a lima bean cut out of my arm. And done on the freaking spot. Ignored what I thought was a cyst for a few years then finally went to a doctor. Far as they know, I don't have any other cancer in my now so maybe not a worst thing but definitely freaked me out. I thought I had a zit in a weird place. The back of my pointer finger. Then I thought it might have been a spider bite. Few days later it had grown pretty big and the swelling had gone to the palm. It was MRSA and had it cut out. Turned out fine. But probably would have only had to get some shots, antibiotics if I had it looked at earlier. Was in university and was sitting all day studying for my final that night and the next day. Felt a twang on my right side and it felt like I pulled my shoulder or something. Weird, I've been sitting. Anyways wrote my final that evening. Walked to the bus and was totally winded. Couldn't catch my breath. Mentioned it to my mom. And she said to go see the doctor. I was like nah I have a final to write in the morning. Next morning walked to class. Totally winded. Write my final. Then decided I should go to the doctor. Yep, spontaneous pneumothorax. My lung had a blister and it popped and leaked air into my chest cavity. Untreated it could have led to a tension pneumothorax and I could have had a heart attack. I didn't exactly ignore it but I was like ill just rest and it'll get better. Kept getting fever. Had a throat infection. Sinus infection. Weird looking rash on my legs. I do have an autoimmune disease. So some of this can happen because of my disease. Which is why I didn't show more concern. The throat infection I thought was just strep or something. Took prescribed antibiotics and thought it would go away. But no, was hospitalized for 2 weeks after that. Doctors still don't know what was up because there was a lot going on at once. But they diagnosed part of it as sepsis. Had to take tons of meds and also it turns out I was very anemic so I had to get 3 pints of blood. Turns out I also lost 20 pounds, a lot being muscle, and was bleeding in my colon. They started testing me for cancer because my blood counts were abnormally high. So far it's all been negative. Few more tests to go. It seems there's a fine line between it being my autoimmune disease and it being cancer lol. They're like your disease could cause this. But so could cancer so. First time. I had a weird black mole that was starting to turn scaly. I kept putting off the dermatologist appointment because I figured it was nothing, have had dark moles removed before. Turned out to be stage 1A malignant melanoma equals surgery, and I have some arm meat missing on my bicep. A large gnarly scar. And dermatologist and oncologist appointments every 4 months. Second one. Got my first Crohn's attack in college at 21 with what turned out to be fistulas forming. I didn't have health insurance at the time and I got through it. I hate going to the doctor because I went to the gastro a lot as a kid and they never diagnosed me. I would have the worst waves of excruciating pain in my guts about twice a year that would put me in bed and unable to eat or drink for around 48 hours because I couldn't pass anything. I figured I had lived through it before. Why go now? Last year I had an episode so bad I went to the ER and was hospitalized for a week. Diagnosed with Crohn's. And had to have about 8 inches of large intestine and 8 inches of small intestine removed that had fused together into a woven mass of fistulas. My mid-30s have been fun. But I feel fortunate in regards to both coming out okay. TLDR. I ignored a mole. It was cancer. Years and had to have a bowel resection. I played ice hockey from when I was 7 up until 15. Right around the age of 11 I started to notice knee pain. My parents brushed it off as they wouldn't believe that an 11-year-old had knee pain. The pain continued and began to become unbearable just after making the varsity team for my high school at 15. My parents gave in and took me to the doctor. Turns out I had osteochondritis dissecans that got worse every time I skated. After 5 months in leg braces and 3 months of physical therapy, they didn't get better and I had to quit the sport I loved. When I was in middle school, I had a spot on my butt that hurt. I showed it to my mom. She said it was a pimple or something and was nothing. So I kept going to school, football practice, etc. About a week later I couldn't sit down, it hurt so bad, so my lovely mother was going to pop it with a needle. Thank God when she went to touch it. It was hard as a rock and hot, so she stopped. Turned out to be an infected abscess. By far the worst pain of my life. Spent 2 weeks not being able to sit and taking hour-long baths to let it drain. Genuinely do not recommend. I had trouble breathing and a nasty cough for a couple of months. But I ignored it as I had no insurance at the time. I ended up blacking out from lack of oxygen at work. It turned out it was pneumonia. Extremely painful cramps and a stabbing pain in my lower abdomen. Just never went to a doctor to get checked out until after I moved to a new city and wanted to discuss medication etc. for my PCOS. The only English-speaking endocrinologist happened to also be a gynecologist and insisted on a full checkup. Turns out I'd had endometriosis for years and I had also developed a large mass on my ovary that required surgery. The doctor couldn't believe I didn't know about any of it and told me if the mass hadn't been found it could have continued growing, and if it had twisted the ovary and cut off blood supply it could have gone septic and killed me. Had surgery last September. They removed the mass, burned off the endometriosis and drilled tiny holes in my ovaries that will supposedly help with some of my health issues. It was stressful finding all this out and having to go through it alone in a foreign country. I barely knew what was happening half the time because they mostly communicated with the school-assigned nurse translator that accompanied me to appointments. My mom flew out for my operation to be with me, and when they removed the mass and tested for cancer, they didn't inform me of anything. They told her it came back negative. Showed her the mass and she had to pass that info along to me. The doctors never thought to tell me more than the bare minimum throughout the whole process. They always deferred to whoever seemed to be taking care of me. More authoritative. I was extremely scared and anxious from the first appointment right through to my post-op checkups. If I'd seen a doctor sooner, it's very likely that the whole experience would have been better and my quality of life could have been better much sooner too. I can't believe I just lived in pain like that, thinking it was normal. P.S. Sorry about the lack of correct terminology and somewhat basic descriptions. All this took place in China, so I only understand what I've been told by my doctors plus what I've been able to read from translating my surgery notes using a translation app. Peed thick blood from a kidney infection due to losing my virginity using spermicide condoms and not peeing soon enough. Worst pain of my life. Edit. I have since learned that having with a fuller bladder feels better anyway. But I was never taught I had to pee after until I saw the doctor. I hadn't peed until probably 2 hours later that night, and 2 days later I was peeing blood. The doc also said spermicide condoms increase risk for UTIs. Which is probably why I got a kidney infection too instead of just a basic UTI. They also said once you get one you're more susceptible. Which is pretty much a guarantee for me if I don't pee. Had a wisdom tooth removed. Was on a fair amount of ibuprofen for the following week or so. I don't often get headaches, but I had a constant headache. Around the same time. So when my tooth was feeling better I kept popping the ibuprofen for my headaches. About 2 weeks later I started pooping black. That's weird I thought, but let it go for about a week. Then I started getting really sick and pale. My wife convinced me to go to the hospital. Turns out that the ibuprofen has caused a stomach bleed and I had been internally bleeding into my stomach and digesting it as food. Thus the black poop. The doctor said that I had lost about 40 to 45% of my blood, and if I had stayed home that night I would have likely gone into shock and died of blood loss. Blood transfusion and a few weeks of anemia and I was fine. It turns out that shooting pains when shaking someone's hand is my body's code for you have a tumor eating your finger bone. Gallstones. Now when I eat a triple cheese pizza, I will feel pain and take almost 3 to 4 days for the pain to subdue.